So if we continue looking at methods, we'll define a method exactly here. So when we define a method, the definition is the code that starts with this identifier, and it has a name and a signature. And we'll take apart the name and the signature in the next slide here. And a chunk of code that this name references. And so that definition, if you noticed in the program I did, I put at the top of the program so that we would have all the code that links to the name, in this case Max. And then when we invoke it in some other class, like the main class, we use the name and the arguments. Your book's going to call them parameters. I have always been taught they're arguments. They're interchangeable words. So if we look in detail, we have the header. The header defines the method inside of the class. The modifier lets me know if it's private just to this class or public that other classes can see it. And we'll play with seeing methods in other classes probably in the next lecture. And then in the return type, this is the type of memory that the program needs to have available for whatever the method returns. It'll have a name and a list of parameters. And this list can have 0 to as many parameters as we have memory for. And this the name and the parameters is called a signature. It has to be exactly the same for the reference to the code. I can't send it a double because this won't accept a double. And what has to happen is Java has to make the right memory types to pass information in, and the right memory in the return value to return information back out. And so our method is defined in this header, and then the code that it runs, and then it returns particular results. And then in another piece of code, like in our main, we take the name and the argument list, and that invokes this code, filling in for number 1 whatever we pass into this first variable, and filling in number 2 whatever we pass in for the second variable. So if we look at the method signature itself, it is the combination of the method name and the parameter list. And we're going to do something called overloading methods a little bit later on, where we can have the same name but different parameter lists. And that will create different methods for those. Now, the variables in the method header are called the formal parameters. And they are what values are accessible inside of the code block for the method. The actual parameters are the values that we pass inside of the program. And then in the return type value has to be passed back out of the program. So let's go over and we're going to code this max method. We're going to we're going to pass two integers in, and we're going to return the value of the largest one. So let me get back to Eclipse. I'm going to right click on chapter 2, and I'm going to do a new class. Now you'll lose the class type here, but I'm going to call this max. Max program. I'll call it maximizer. We'll see this when I do the class, and I'll include the public static void main. And so I'm going to call this maximizer, my class. And I'm going to start by doing my method. It's going to be a public static. It's going to be an integer, and I'm going to call it max. So here's the beginning of my header. It's going to pass an integer number 1 and an integer number 2. So those are my arguments or formal parameters. And the code I'm going to do in here is an if statement. If my number 1 is bigger than number 2, I'm going to return number 1 because I want to return the maximum number. Else, I'm going to return number 2. So logically, if I give this program 2 numbers, it's going to return the larger of the 2 values, or the largest number. If they're exactly the same, it will return number 2. It doesn't matter. I'm not returning the variable number 1 or number 2. I'm returning the value inside number 1 and number 2. So let's test this. Let's make some 3 integers here. I'll make I 1. I'll make J 5, and I'll make K 28. And what I can do is I can print out the larger of 2 numbers. So if I do system.out.printf, I'll keep using printfs here. The larger number of %d and %d is %d / new line. So again, I'm using printf to format my output. So I'm going to say I and j. So the larger of I and j is max I comma j. And so here's where I'm invoking this. I'm going to give it I and j, and I'm going to print the larger of the 2 numbers. And when I invoke this, Java uses this code in place of the word max, and it gives I and j to fill in the space in this code for number 1 and number 2. So if I run this, I get the larger number of 1 and 5 is 5. Well, if I come back here and do I and k, I get the larger number of 1 and 28 is 28. Now let's do them backwards. I'll do k and j here. And so I'm asking the larger of 28 and 5 is 28. So this max code runs every time I need the max of 2 numbers. And I don't have to do this if statement every time I have 2 numbers. This method will be able to pull out and get the return value. Now, it doesn't care about the variables k and j. It accepts the values inside of them and spits back out a value. So it can't tell me that k is bigger than j. It can just tell me the number that is bigger from these 2 that I gave it. So let's look at what happens inside of here. If we create in the main program these integers, and I ask for k to have the larger of the values between these. So I set this up, and when it gets to max ij, this code that was previously declared runs. And it will compare number 1 and number 2, and it will store the larger value. And it will return the larger value back to the program in place of this function. So k gets the numerical value that whatever the result was. And so we call the method inside of, in this case, main, and this code runs in place of the name of that method. There is a thing to watch in return statements. Now, I used an if statement, and I returned inside of the if. And this code on the left is logically correct. It will return the correct value, but because the compiler doesn't do any comparison mathematics, the compiler can't tell if I'm guaranteed to have a return statement called. This last else if might not run. The compiler thinks, well, this could be false, this could be false, this could be false, and it never sees a guaranteed return statement, even though our logic is correct. So a way of rewriting this is to have the logic so it bottoms out in an else statement with a return, and the compiler will be okay with the one on the right. And so this is the general idea of building a method. In the next video, we're going to look at how we can reuse methods from other classes so that we can have different class methods be called from other programs. We've been doing this all along when we've been using the methods that Java has built in the math class or in the java.util class. So we're going to look at how we can create our own collection of methods and call them from other programs.